Imagine a top government official, right? Like someone who basically holds the entire economy in the palm of their hands.
Okay.
They step up to a microphone, the room is dead quiet, the cameras are flashing, and then they just apologize for causing the worst economic disaster in human history.
Wait, like a literal apology. That sounds completely made up.
It sounds totally fabricated.
Yeah.
But in 2002, a future leader of the central banking system did exactly that. He stood up and said, referring to the Great Depression, he literally said, "We did it. We're very sorry. We won't do it again."
Oh, wow. That's a heavy admission.
Yeah, it really is. Welcome to the Missing Lessons, where we explain what school never did.
We are jumping right into it today.
We really are. Today, we're doing a deep dive into an era that didn't just, alter the history books. It completely rewired how money, jobs, and just basic human survival function today.
Right, because understanding how a government can accidentally destroy its own economy for over a decade, that's the key to understanding how your own bank account is actually protected right now.
Exactly. And hey, if you're enjoying the Missing Lessons, make sure to follow the podcast, leave a rating, and share it with someone who might find it interesting. It helps us create more deep dives and reach more curious minds.
So let's get into the mechanics of this failure, because it really is the ultimate cautionary tale, isn't it?
It totally is. It's a mechanical failure of a system that everyone at the time assumed was just invincible. And the tragic irony is that the people who were supposed to prevent the collapse were actually the ones who accelerated it.
Which is wild. So where do we start? The 1920s.
Yeah, we have to look at the setup. The 1920s are universally branded as this era of jazz and flappers and boundless prosperity, right? Factories were just churning out consumer goods.
Right. Cars, radios, the new household appliances.
Exactly. But there was a massive structural flaw hidden under all of that production. The wealth generated by that boom was highly concentrated. So the everyday factory worker, the average farmer, they didn't actually have the cash on hand to purchase all these new innovations.
I feel like I know where this is going. If people don't have the cash to buy the shiny new things, someone invents a way for them to buy it with money they don't actually have.
Bingo.
Credit.
Credit.
And it wasn't just a slow introduction. It was an absolute explosion. Just to give you the sheer scale of it, consumer credit in 1919 sat at about $100 million nationwide.
Okay, 100 million.
Just 10 years later, by 1929, it had skyrocketed to over $7 billion.
$7 billion? In a decade. In one decade. The entire Roaring '20s boom was basically built on an IOU. People were leveraging their future labor to fund their current lifestyles.
That is just, think about that for a second. Have you ever noticed this in your own life? Like buying things on credit that you can't actually afford? It's such an easy trap to fall into today, but they were inventing the trap back then.
Yeah, exactly. But taking out an installment plan for a new washing machine doesn't bring down the entire global financial system.
Right. People take out car loans today, and the economy doesn't just vaporize.
Right, so there had to be something far more systemic going on. And the problem was that this culture of leverage, this whole idea that you could buy things with borrowed money, it bled directly into the financial markets.
Oh, the stock market.
Yep. It became the default way to interact with Wall Street. People were engaging in rampant speculation. They were buying stocks on margin.
Meaning what exactly? Like putting a down payment on a stock?
Essentially, yeah. You could buy a stock by putting down just a fraction of the cost, sometimes as little as 10%, and you borrow the rest from your broker. The widespread assumption was that the market would just go up forever.
So the logic is you buy the stock, it doubles in value, you pay back the loan, and you keep a massive profit, even though you barely put any of your own money on the line.
You nailed it. It's almost identical to a modern tech startup bubble or like crypto speculation today.
Right, it's just amplifying your gains. But doesn't that also exponentially amplify your risks? Like if the market drops by just 10%.
Your entire initial investment is completely wiped out. Gone.
Wow, so it's incredibly fragile.
Super fragile. It created this ecosystem filled with Ponzi schemes, fake companies, and absolutely zero regulatory oversight. And the illusion finally shattered in October 1929.
Black Thursday.
The market crashed and millions of shares were dumped in a blind panic. And because everyone had bought on margin, brokers started issuing what are called margin calls.
Which means they wanted their money back right then.
Exactly. They demanded immediate repayment. So to get the cash, investors had to sell whatever stocks they had left at rock bottom prices, which, of course, drove the market down even further.
Some vicious cycle.
Yeah, overnight, the blind faith that was holding the whole system together just evaporated.
Okay, but a stock market crash is devastating, sure. We've had massive market crashes since then, right? Like 1987, 2008, 2020. And they didn't result in a decade of literal starvation for the entire country. Why did this specific crash metastasize into the Great Depression?
This is where we get to the fatal error. This is the exact mistake that central bankers are still apologizing for a century later. The people in charge of the money supply actively let the system collapse.
Wait, they let it collapse? On purpose?
Yeah. The central banking system in the U.S. was originally designed to act as a lender of last resort. The theory is that during a severe panic, the central bank steps in, floods the system with cash to keep banks afloat, and acts as a firewall.
Right, to stop the bleeding.
But instead of doing that, the central bank actually raised interest rates right after the crash.
I'm going to stop you there because that makes absolutely zero logical sense.
Right.
Raising interest rates makes borrowing money more expensive. Why on earth would you make money harder to get when the entire economy is suffocating from a lack of cash?
Because the officials in charge were operating under this brutal economic philosophy that was super popular at the time. It was known as the liquidationist theory.
Liquidationist. That sounds intense.
It was. The core belief of liquidationism is that economic depressions are actually natural, healthy consequences of periods of excess. They viewed the speculation of the 1920s as a disease, and they saw the crash as the cure.
So they literally wanted things to fail.
Yeah, the Treasury Secretary at the time famously advised the president to liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate.
Wow.
They honestly believed this would purge the rotten elements from the system. It's like, think of a forest fire.
Like letting the dead wood burn away so a healthier forest can grow back.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Don't the liquidationists kind of have a valid point in theory?
I mean, I guess. If a government steps in and bails out every single bank or business that makes reckless gambling decisions, you create what they call moral hazard.
Right. You teach them they can take insane risks and the taxpayer will just catch them when they fall.
Yeah. Which is a debate we literally still have today every time a massive corporation asks for a bailout.
Totally. So the liquidationists weren't necessarily evil. They were just catastrophically wrong about the mechanics of a modern banking system. They failed to realize that the banking system isn't a collection of isolated trees where you can just let the sick ones burn.
It's all connected.
It's deeply connected. When you let the bad banks fail, the fire immediately jumps to the good banks. And the mechanism that spreads that fire is human panic.
Oh, because banks don't actually hold all of their depositors' money in a vault. They lend it out to build houses and fund businesses.
Exactly.
So if people even get a hint that banks are being allowed to fail, logic dictates you should be the first person in line to pull your money out.
Which sparked massive nationwide bank runs. Picture the sheer terror of hearing a rumor that the bank holding your entire life savings might lock its doors forever at 5 p.m.
You'd sprint down there. I'd sprint down there.
Your neighbors sprint down there. And the sudden, frantic demand for physical cash forced even the most conservative, responsible banks into bankruptcy simply because they lacked the liquid currency to hand over to everyone at the exact same moment.
So they weren't necessarily broke. They just didn't have the cash on hand.
Right. They weren't insolvent. They were illiquid. But the result was exactly the same. The doors locked. The money just vanished.
That is heartbreaking. Innocent people who had absolutely nothing to do with stock market speculation. People who just kept their heads down and saved their wages were instantly wiped out.
So the firewall didn't just fail. The central bank actively poured gasoline on the fire by refusing to provide cash.
What happens to the broader economy when that much wealth just evaporates overnight?
The mathematical reality of what followed is truly terrifying. Because thousands of banks completely collapsed, the actual supply of money circulating in the United States dropped by nearly 30% between 1930 and 1933.
30% of all money just ceased to exist.
It vanished. And when there is 30% less money chasing the same amount of goods, the prices of those goods plummet. This is the textbook definition of deflation. Over that period, the prices of everyday goods dropped by 30%.
Which, I mean, sounds fantastic if you're a consumer. Things getting cheaper usually feels like a win.
It feels like a win until you look at the macroeconomic feedback loop. Imagine you're a wheat farmer in 1930. The price of wheat drops by 30%. That means your income just dropped by 30%.
Oh, right.
So to keep your farm operating, you have to slash wages, fire your farmhands, and stop buying new equipment.
And multiply that by every farm and factory in the country.
Exactly. Because businesses are making less money, they lay off massive amounts of workers. Those newly unemployed workers have zero money to spend, which means demand drops even further, which forces businesses to lower prices again just to survive.
A total deflationary spiral.
But here's the most devastating mechanic of deflation. While your income and the value of your assets drop, your debts remain completely unchanged.
Ah, I see. If you took out a $1,000 loan to buy a tractor, and suddenly the crops you sell to pay that loan are worth half as much, your debt burden has effectively doubled.
Right. Deflation actively punishes the people who took out loans to build the country. The math just becomes impossible. You can't pay the bank. So the bank forecloses on your farm.
But the bank can't sell your farm to recoup their losses because nobody else has any money either.
Exactly. The bank takes the loss, another bank fails, and the spiral just spins faster. By 1933, the human cost of this mechanical failure was almost unfathomable. 25% of the total workforce was officially unemployed.
25%, that's what, nearly 13 million people?
Yeah, 13 million people with zero income in an era with absolutely no social safety nets. And for the individuals lucky enough to hold on to a job, average wages dropped by over 40%. We're talking about a level of everyday desperation that fundamentally broke the social fabric of the country.
It just sounds so bleak.
Families were literally fracturing. They were sending children away because they physically could not afford the caloric intake to keep everyone under one roof.
That's horrifying. I've actually seen photographs of the teenagers from that era. You had an entire generation of kids who should have been sitting in high school or learning a trade, just riding train boxcars as hobos, crisscrossing the continent desperately looking for any scrap of manual labor.
And then you have the rise of Hoovervilles, these sprawling shantytowns made of packing crates, scrap metal, and abandoned cars just built by homeless communities on the fringes of major cities.
Right, and the name Hooverville was a direct, bitter insult aimed at President Herbert Hoover.
Very much so. The public viewed him as completely paralyzed, just hopelessly committed to that failed liquidationist mindset. And when desperation reaches that level, society starts looking for scapegoats.
Human nature, unfortunately.
Yeah, the culture turned incredibly dark. There was immense public pressure, and in some places, actual legislative bans preventing married women from holding jobs.
Wait, really? They banned married women from working?
Yeah. The twisted logic was that every working wife was supposedly stealing a job that rightfully belonged to a male breadwinner. It became an environment of absolute scarcity, basically pitting every demographic against each other for basic survival.
And as if that wasn't a perfect storm of misery, the economic collapse collided directly with an environmental apocalypse. The Dust Bowl.
Yes. It didn't just happen at the same time. It compounded the exact vulnerabilities we're talking about. The Great Plains states were struck by this extreme, prolonged drought. But it wasn't just weather.
Right, it was man-made.
Exactly. It was the result of the same speculative greed we saw in the stock market, just applied to agriculture. Decades of aggressive, mechanized deep plowing had completely stripped the natural deep-rooted grasses from the plains to plant cash crops like wheat.
So when the rain stopped, there was nothing holding the topsoil down.
Nothing. It just dried to dust and blew away. This created those apocalyptic dust storms like Black Sunday, where the storms were so massive and dense they literally blotted out the sun across entire states.
People were suffocating in their own living rooms. It destroyed millions of acres of farmland. And that created a massive wave of internal refugees, right?
Yeah. Hundreds of thousands of desperate families abandoned their dead farms, packed whatever they could onto modified cars, and migrated west toward California, just chasing rumors of agricultural work.
Just put yourself in their shoes for a second. What would you do in that situation? With no money, no home, and absolutely no job prospects. And the crazy part is, when they arrived in California, there was no salvation.
Not at all.
They were met by local police blockades. They were treated as disease-ridden intruders in their own country, pushed into squalid squatter camps.
The systemic failure was just absolute. Charities were bankrupt, local governments were broke, and the American people finally realized that the old economic orthodoxy, the idea that the free market would always magically correct itself, was a deadly fantasy.
Which brings us to the pivot. Because a crisis of this magnitude requires a complete redefinition of what the government is actually supposed to do.
Right. So in 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected, promising a New Deal. But how do you even begin to approach a machine that is this fundamentally broken?
You have to stop the bleeding first. You have to break the psychology of the panic.
Exactly. Immediately upon taking office in 1933, FDR did something entirely unprecedented. He declared a national banking holiday. He forcibly closed every single bank in the United States for several days.
Wow, just shuts them all down.
Shut them down. This physically halted the bank runs. Then he bypassed the traditional press and utilized the era's cutting-edge technology, the radio.
The famous fireside chats.
Yep. He delivered the first of his fireside chats, speaking directly into the living rooms of terrified citizens in plain, simple English. He explained the mechanics of the bank holiday. He assured them that federal inspectors were evaluating the banks, that only the solvent ones would be allowed to reopen.
And he essentially told them that keeping their money in a reopened bank was statistically safer than hiding it under a mattress.
Right. It was an absolute masterclass in psychological management. He didn't just issue a decree, he explained the why. And when you demystify the process, you remove the terror.
Right, it worked, didn't it?
It was astonishingly effective. When the designated banks reopened their doors a few days later, the lines of people weren't there to withdraw cash, they were lined up to deposit it. The immediate financial panic was broken.
Okay, but the broader economy was still paralyzed. Private businesses still weren't hiring.
True. So the Roosevelt administration unleashed the alphabet agencies, which was this massive wave of federal programs designed to act as the employer of last resort.
Like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, and the Works Progress Administration, the WPA.
Exactly. The CCC took hundreds of thousands of unemployed young men out of the desperate cities and put them in rural camps, paying them to plant billions of trees, fight forest fires, and build the infrastructure of the national parks.
And the WPA was even larger, right?
Yeah. Much larger. It eventually employed over 8.5 million Americans over its lifespan. The brilliance of these programs was that they weren't just handing out welfare checks, which many viewed as degrading at the time. They were trading a wage for labor, preserving the dignity of the workforce while literally building the physical infrastructure of the 20th century.
Schools, hospitals, hydroelectric dams, LaGuardia airport projects we literally still rely on today.
Yeah. And the fascinating part to me is how expansive their definition of infrastructure actually was. The government didn't just hire steel workers and bricklayers. They recognized that a nation's culture and historical record are vital components of its survival.
Oh, right. They paid unemployed writers to document local histories, musicians to give free concerts.
They even paid famous photographers to travel into those squatter camps and capture the unvarnished, brutal reality of the migrant families. They essentially funded the documentation of their own crisis.
That is such a profound shift in civic philosophy. But, and this is a crucial nuance if we pull back and look at the big picture, we have to acknowledge a vital limitation of the New Deal.
Which is?
For all its massive scale and all the millions of families it saved from acute starvation, it didn't actually end the Great Depression.
That's a great point. The federal spending, while unprecedented, just wasn't large enough to fill the massive crater left by the collapse of private industry. The economy just kind of limped along. There was even a severe double-dip recession in 1937 when the administration prematurely tried to cut back on spending to balance the budget.
So if the New Deal was essentially this incredibly well-designed life support system, what actually cured the patient?
The brutal reality is that it took a global war. It wasn't until the United States entered World War II in 1941 that the Depression truly ended.
Because it forced the government into a state of absolute staggering deficit spending.
Exactly. They essentially drafted the entire remaining unemployed population into the military or into factories to build tanks and airplanes. That brute force fiscal stimulus is what finally returned the American economy to full employment capacity.
Wow. So looking at the entire arc of this disaster, from the credit-fueled illusions of the 1920s to the liquidationist blunders and the massive federal intervention, it really seems like the modern financial system we operate in today is entirely a reaction to the 1930s.
It is the absolute foundation of our current reality. Before 1929, if you lost your job or your bank failed or you got too old to work, you were largely on your own. The sheer terror of the Depression forced the creation of systemic guardrails.
Like unemployment insurance.
Yes, and they created Social Security so that the elderly wouldn't freeze to death when their working years ended. And perhaps most importantly for the financial system, they created the FDIC federal insurance on bank deposits.
Meaning that if a bank mismanages its funds and goes bankrupt today, The federal government legally guarantees that you will get your deposited money back up to a certain limit.
Exactly. They structurally eliminated the logical incentive for a bank run. They engineered the panic out of the system.
That is so important to understand. But while the banking sector has these massive macroeconomic guardrails now, the lessons for our own individual resilience are just as critical today as they were a century ago.
How so?
Well, the 1920s proved how seductive and dangerous over-leverage can be. If you want to become financially resilient and insulate yourself against systemic shocks, the foundational rule is to avoid funding a lifestyle entirely through debt.
That is such a good point. Economic expansions always feel permanent to the people living inside them, but history guarantees they are not.
Exactly. And it's an incredibly modern trap. It is easier today to leverage yourself with digital credit, buy now, pay later apps, and margin trading than it has ever been in human history.
Oh, without a doubt. And when the cycle turns, if you are heavily indebted against assets that are suddenly dropping in value, you become deeply vulnerable to the exact same mechanics that wiped out the 1920s speculators.
Which totally reframes the idea of building an emergency savings fund. It's not just generic advice from a personal finance textbook. Capital reserves are your personal defense perimeter.
I love that phrase, personal defense perimeter.
Right. You cannot control central bank interest rates,
Right.
and you cannot control global supply chains, but you can control having a buffer of liquid cash that allows you to survive a deflationary shock without being forced to sell your assets at a loss. You basically have to act as your own lender of last resort.
That is incredibly actionable advice.
And actually, here's a question for everyone listening. If a major systemic economic crisis hit the world tomorrow, what is the very first tangible thing you would do to protect your own household? Think about your immediate vulnerabilities. Let us know your thoughts in the comments.
I'm really curious to see those answers. We've charted a massive historical failure today. We looked at how a culture obsessed with debt built a fragile illusion of prosperity, how the mathematical failure of central bankers triggered a catastrophic deflationary spiral, and how the resulting desperation fundamentally altered the contract between a government and its citizens.
It really changes how you look at the systems around us.
It does. The most vital takeaway here is that a modern economy is not a law of physics. It's not a self-healing machine. It is a highly delicate, fragile construct built entirely on human psychology and confidence. Keeping it functioning requires active, intelligent maintenance.
Absolutely.
If you enjoyed this episode of The Missing Lessons, don't forget to follow the podcast, leave a rating, and share it with a friend. Your support helps us continue exploring the topics school never taught us.
We really appreciate it.
But I want to leave you with a haunting question. If the architects of the 1920s economy were so blind to their own systemic risks that they had to apologize a century later as we invent entirely new forms of digital credit, algorithmic trading, and decentralized finance today, what are the invisible, catastrophic mistakes we are making right now that someone will have to apologize for a century from today?